Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to the year 1890, into a world where Halloween wasn't about candy or costumes, but about rituals, fears, and beliefs that blurred the line between the living and the dead. So, before we begin, make sure to give this video a like and hit that follow button if you love learning about the eerie and beautiful traditions that shaped our past. Now, imagine this: not a modern suburban neighborhood filled with plastic pumpkins and porch lights, but a small countryside village in late October. The air is cold enough to make your breath visible. The scent of damp leaves and wood smoke fills the night, and the only light comes from carved lanterns, except they're not pumpkins yet. They're turnips, hollowed, rough, and glowing from within, their crooked smiles flickering through candlelight. In 1890, a Halloween night in a rural household was more than a celebration. It was a watchful evening, a night when people believed that the barrier between worlds grew thin, when spirits could slip through cracks in doors and whispers could travel through the wind. Families gathered close, not for fun but for protection, wrapped in warmth and superstition. Inside one such cottage, the fire burns low. The room smells like smoke, sage, and beeswax. On the table sits a single carved turnip, its grin jagged and uneven, the ancestor of our modern jack-o'-lantern. People in those days didn't carve for decoration, they carved for defense. The crooked face wasn't meant to charm. It was meant to scare away what they couldn't see. In this small home, a family of 6 huddles near the hearth. The father keeps the poker close at hand, not for intruders, but for luck. The mother hums an old Gallic song, one she learned from her grandmother, said to keep away restless spirits. The grandmother herself, sitting nearest the fire, murmurs prayers while her fingers run rhythmically over wooden rosary beads. To her, prayer and superstition live side by side. Holy words meet ancient customs, all for the same purpose: to guard the living from the wandering dead. Outside, the orchard rustles in the cold wind. Branches, bare of fruit, creak and sway. To the villagers, orchards were sacred after harvest. They believed that if you didn't leave an offering, an apple, a crust of bread, a cup of milk, the spirits of the field might take offense. Some even said the dead of the village came back to walk among the trees, their pale faces glimpsed between the branches on nights like this. Back inside, the grandmother sprinkles a thin line of ashes along the threshold, whispering, "Boundaries are kept by care." It's an old saying, part prayer, part spell. The idea was simple: fire keeps out the cold, and ash keeps out the dark. It was her way of marking the border between the known and the unknown. The children are quiet. The eldest boy stares into the fire, tracing the glow of embers as if they're stars caught inside the chimney. The youngest clutches her rag doll, made from scraps of old linen and stuffed with lavender for calm. She's not frightened exactly, but she listens to the wind, and in that house, everyone listens. Because in 1890, silence wasn't emptiness, it was awareness. The knock at the door, when it comes, is soft, 3 times, evenly spaced. Not frantic, not loud, just steady, deliberate. The father rises, slow and cautious. He doesn't rush, because he knows what night it is. The mother stops humming. The grandmother's fingers tighten on the beads. "Do we answer?" the eldest boy whispers. The grandmother shakes her head. Not yet. For people in that era, A knock on Halloween could mean many things and not all of them good. In Ireland and Scotland, it was said that spirits of the dead might test the kindness of the living by knocking in disguise. Open the door too soon, and you might invite them in. Ignore them completely, and you risk offending them. So what did families do? They waited. The fire pops, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howls through the orchard, carrying with it a faint whistle that could almost be mistaken for a sigh. The father listens carefully, his hand on the poker. The sound comes again, a knock, then silence. The grandmother whispers something old, words that sound more like a song than a prayer. Her voice is steady, wrapping around the room like a blanket. Fear invites what watches, she says. Calm keeps the night at bay. And so, no one moves. The knocking stops. After a long moment, the father steps closer to the door. He doesn't open it. Instead, he traces a cross in the air and whispers a phrase under his breath. Then he sets a small wooden bowl near the entrance. Inside it, a slice of bread, a drop of milk, and a bit of honey, an offering to the unseen. Because back then, people believed generosity protected better than weapons. They thought the spirits of the dead, if acknowledged kindly, would pass by without harm. And maybe they were right. As the night deepens, the fire burns lower. The family draws closer. The grandmother hums softly again, and her song mingles with the wind and the creaking wood. The turnip lantern flickers, its crooked grin glowing brighter for a moment, as if satisfied. It's strange, isn't it? How so much of what we do today, for fun, carving pumpkins, lighting candles, sharing ghost stories, comes from nights like this. Nights where belief was a kind of survival, when light wasn't decoration, but protection. In 1890, Halloween wasn't a child's game, it was a vigil. But not everything was fear. There were games too, rituals meant to predict the future. The eldest girl, curious and brave, brings out a bowl of water and an apple. For luck, she says. It's an old tradition. Bobbing for apples wasn't about fun, it was about fate. Catching the apple meant good fortune, maybe even a glimpse of your future spouse. Superstition wrapped in laughter. The grandmother watches with a knowing smile. Don't spill, she says softly. Water remembers. It sounds poetic now, but to them, it was serious. Water was sacred mirrors too. That's why some girls, later that night, would stand before a darkened mirror with a candle, hoping to see the face of the one they would marry. Sometimes they claimed they did. Sometimes they saw nothing. And once in a while, they saw something else. Outside, the orchard whispers again. The wind shifts. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaks open. Maybe it's just the breeze. Or maybe it's something older. Inside, though, the family remains steady. Their rituals, ashes, prayers, songs, the glow of the lantern are enough. Halloween, for them, isn't about fear. It's about balance. Light and shadow. Warmth and cold. The living and the dead, all acknowledging one another in quiet understanding. As midnight approaches, the rain begins to fall. The sound is soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. The grandmother stirs the fire, sending sparks into the chimney. It's a good sign, she whispers. Rain keeps the restless from wandering. The children relax. The father lowers the poker. The mother hums again, her voice slow and soothing. The grandmother's beads click softly as she finishes her prayer. The turnip lantern's flame flickers once, twice, then steadies. The night outside listens, but it does not intrude. And that's how many families across the countryside spent Halloween night in 1890. In warmth, in care, and in quiet watchfulness. A night not of fright, but of respect. A night that has almost vanished from memory, replaced by parties and candy, but once filled with meaning and patience. So next time you light a pumpkin, maybe remember the turnip, the first lantern, carved not for decoration, but for protection. Remember the ashes along the floor, the whispered songs, and the belief that calm could keep the dark at bay. Because long before Halloween became about fun, it was about faith. And somewhere, in a quiet old cottage from 1890, that crooked turnip lantern still smiles watchful, steady, and eternal. Outside the small cottage, the village slept under a blanket of fog. The rain had eased into a thin mist, wrapping itself around the apple trees and stone fences like a living thing. Oil lanterns flickered along the narrow dirt road, their flames dim and wavering against the night breeze. It was past midnight, now the hour that people in 1890 called the thin time, when the veil between worlds could ripple like a pond struck by a stone. Hey guys, welcome back. If you just joined us, we're in the middle of a Halloween night over a century ago, before costumes, before candy, before porch lights and parties. This was a night when people listened for whispers in the wind and lighted candles not for decoration, but for safety. If you're enjoying this glimpse into the strange and beautiful world of old Halloween, make sure to give this video a like and follow for more stories like this one. Now, as the family in the cottage rests in quiet warmth, the rest of the village is far from silent. Down the muddy road, at the edge of the orchard, another fire burns, a communal one. Around it gather the older children, the unmarried women, and a few brave men with mugs of cider in their hands. This was the time for games of fate, the kind that mixed laughter with unease, where you never quite knew if you were inviting good fortune or something else. The most mysterious of these old rituals was called the Dumb Supper. The name itself tells you much. No one was allowed to speak. The idea was that by silence alone, you could invite the presence of a future lover, or sometimes a spirit that wanted to be heard. In a small barn lit only by candles, the young women prepared the table. Every detail mattered. The number of plates, the type of food, the direction of the chairs. They set the table backward, plates reversed, chairs facing the opposite way, even the bread sliced in silence. The girls would then sit and eat without saying a word, hearts pounding in the hush, waiting to see who or what might appear. Some swore they saw shadows form at the other end of the table, a faint silhouette seated just beyond the candlelight. Others claimed a chill would move through the room, though no window was open. And once in a while, someone would say they saw the face of their intended reflected faintly in the mirror behind them. Not everyone was brave enough to try. For those who preferred a gentler path, there were other games, throwing apple peels over your shoulder to see what letter they formed on the floor, or holding a candle before a mirror to glimpse your future. In 1890, every object in the home could be a portal for hope or fear. Fire, water, glass, even bread, all were symbols of something larger. One young woman named Clara, barely 20, was the first to speak after the supper ended. "Nothing came," she whispered, though her voice trembled. but I felt something move past me." The others laughed nervously. They didn't know whether to believe her or to pretend nothing happened. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, shaking the loose boards of the barn. One candle flickered out. For a moment, silence hung heavy, the kind that seems to have its own heartbeat. Then someone laughed, maybe just to break the tension. The candle was relit, the laughter spread, and life went on. That was the strange magic of these nights. Fear and fun existed side by side, inseparable. People didn't seek terror, they sought connection. Connection with what came before them, and with what might come after. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, the grandmother stirs in her chair. She knows the young people are out there playing their dangerous games, whispering to the night. She doesn't scold them, she remembers being one of them. But she mutters softly, "There are doors you knock on only once." The fire hums. The ashes along the hearth glow faintly in the dark. And the turnip lantern still grins its crooked grin, as though keeping watch over the world beyond the door. In villages like this, across Ireland, Scotland, and even the rural parts of America, Halloween, then called All Hallows' Eve, or Nutcrack Night, wasn't a single event. It was a layered night of rituals, games, and reverence. You honored the dead, you invited good fortune, and you guarded your home from anything that might wander too far from the shadows. And superstition wasn't seen as foolish. It was wisdom in disguise, a way of giving shape to uncertainty. When the crops failed or sickness came, people didn't have modern science to comfort them. They had stories, symbols, and rituals, like a language that spoke to the unseen. In one corner of the village, an old man lit 3 candles on a stone windowsill. One for the living, one for the lost, and one for those who might still find their way home. He didn't say a prayer aloud, but his lips moved in rhythm with the flames. Every year, he did the same. And though it sounds haunting now, it wasn't meant to be. For people in 1890, death wasn't an enemy. It was part of the circle. Halloween wasn't about ghosts chasing you. It was about remembering them, welcoming them, and showing them you were still living with care. In the distance, the church bell rang once, a low, heavy tone rolling through the fog. The villagers listened. Some crossed themselves. Others simply whispered, "Let the night pass gently." Inside the cottage, the grandmother smiled faintly, as if she heard it too. The fire burned low, but steady. The father stirred the coals, sending tiny sparks into the air, and the children breathed in unison, warm and safe. Beyond the walls, the fog thickened, soft and white, like breath on glass. The turnip lantern's grin glowed faintly through the window, its light bending the mist. Somewhere in the orchard, a fox moved quietly, its fur glistening with dew. The world seemed to hold its breath alive, patient, and full of quiet secrets. That was Halloween in 1890. Not a night of sugar and shouting, but of whispers and warmth. A night where every flicker of fire carried meaning, and every shadow could be a story. And though the turnip lantern may seem crude compared to our glowing pumpkins today, its message was clear and timeless. Light the darkness, but never mock it. Respect what watches. Remember what came before. By the time the church bell tolled twice, the fog had thickened over the orchard, rolling in slow, silver waves. The night had deepened into that strange, heavy stillness that made every small sound feel louder: the creak of an old board, the hiss of cooling embers, the whisper of wind through thatched roofs. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going deeper into the mysteries of Halloween in 1890, a time when firelight was the only glow people trusted, and the line between superstition and survival was razor thin. If you're enjoying this quiet descent into forgotten folklore, make sure to hit that like button and follow for more journeys into the world's strangest histories. Now, where were we? Ah yes, in the small, fog-wrapped village. The night isn't done speaking. The dumb supper has ended. The cider fire outside burns low, but Halloween's truest rituals are only beginning. In the back room of the cottage, the eldest girl, maybe 16, sits before a mirror. Her mother would scold her if she knew, but curiosity has a pull stronger than fear. On her lap lies a small candle stub and an apple she'd stolen from the basket earlier. This is one of the oldest Halloween superstitions, the mirror spell. They said that if you ate an apple before a mirror at midnight, you might catch a glimpse of the person you were meant to marry. But you had to eat in silence. One wrong word, one sound, and the spirit would vanish, or worse, stay. She sets the candle down, the flame trembling slightly. The mirror is old, its glass uneven and full of tiny distortions. For a moment she sees only her own face, shadowed and gold. Then the candle flickers. The air seems to shift. Something, or maybe nothing, moves in the reflection behind her. Her breath catches. But before she can look again, a draft slips through the shutters and blows out the candle. The reflection disappears. She doesn't scream. She only sits there for a long moment, her heart thudding, before whispering softly, "Thank you." Whether to the spirit, the fire, or herself, she doesn't know. Meanwhile, outside, the older boys in the village are running another old ritual, apple bobbing. You might think it's a silly game, but in 1890, it wasn't just play. Apples were symbols of luck and prophecy. Floating apples in a basin of water represented choices, and biting one first could predict who'd marry soonest or who'd have fortune in the coming year. It sounds harmless until you remember that water was thought to be a mirror for the other world. Every reflection, every ripple, was a whisper between worlds. People didn't just dunk their heads for fun. They were testing fate, daring the unseen to answer. Not far from them, another group of girls performs a different kind of test. They each hold a handful of hazelnuts, each one named for a suitor. The nuts are placed near the hearth, and everyone watches as they heat and crack. A nut that burns steadily means love will last. One that pops or rolls away means heartbreak. And if the nut bursts in silence, that's the worst omen of all. It means the name written upon it belongs to someone who will soon fade from your life, one way or another. You can almost see the scene. Laughter around the fire, giggles mixed with anxious glances, the scent of burning nuts and cider in the air. But beneath the laughter is tension, that quiet, centuries-old awareness that Halloween wasn't just a festival of fun, it was a night of testing fate. Even the fire itself was part of the language. It wasn't just heat and light, it was a messenger. In 1890, people read the flames the way we read screens today. If a fire crackled too sharply, they said someone far away was speaking your name. If it hissed, a storm was coming. If it popped suddenly, it meant an unexpected visitor, sometimes welcome, sometimes not. Inside the cottage, the grandmother knows all of this by heart. She doesn't play the games anymore, but she watches. Her rosary beads move slowly, her eyes fixed on the fire's gentle pulse. When the hearth gives a sharp pop, she smiles faintly and mutters, "They're listening tonight." The father, sitting nearby, gives her a tired grin. "Who's listening, Mother?" "The same ones who always do," she answers softly. "Those who built this place before us, those who kept the fires burning long before we were born." She looks at the turnip lantern glowing faintly on the sill, its crooked grin reflecting in her eyes. "They only ask that we keep the light alive." The fire hums. The wind sighs through the cracks in the shutters. The mother hums her soft lullaby again, steady and rhythmic, while the children drowse beneath blankets. And outside, the village road glimmers faintly, with dew a silver thread through the darkness. Down that road, someone passes carrying a single candle in a jar. The light wavers, but doesn't go out. Some say that if you walked alone on Halloween night with a candle that stayed lit until dawn, you'd be blessed with luck for the year. But if the flame went out before sunrise, the blessing turned to warning. Few dared to try. In the distance, the bell tolls again, 3 soft, even strikes. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then goes quiet. The air feels heavier, as if the whole world is listening. The grandmother murmurs, "They're walking now." And indeed, old beliefs said that on Halloween night, the dead didn't come to haunt, they came to walk, just as they once did in life. To visit homes they loved, to see how the living carried on. That's why candles burned in every window, why food was left out, why doors were never locked on this night. The light was both welcome and warning, a signal that said, "We remember you, but do not linger too long." It's strange, isn't it? How something that sounds so eerie could come from a place of love. How what we now call spooky season was once an act of tenderness, a conversation between generations, between life and death, between fear and reverence. That's the heart of Halloween in 1890. Every superstition was a story, every ritual a small act of respect. And as the fog thickens over the orchard, as the turnip lantern burns low, and the family drifts into sleep, the night itself seems to breathe slow, patient, and filled with memories. The further you wander into that 1890 Halloween night, the more you realize it wasn't a single celebration. It was a collision of worlds. Immigrants brought their ghosts, their gods, their fears, and their charms. Every village in America had its own spin on the season. Some Irish families carved turnips with eerie faces to scare away wandering spirits. Germans placed a single candle in the window to guide lost souls home. Scots hung rowan branches by the door, whispering old prayers for protection from witches. And children, always the first to turn fear into fun, wore pillowcases over their heads and banged on doors for sweets long before trick or treat was ever written down. But beneath the laughter and flickering light, there was tension in the air. People in 1890 didn't separate superstition from life. They lived in both worlds at once, the physical and the invisible. You could find a farmer spitting over his shoulder 3 times before entering a barn at night. You might see a mother tying a red thread around her baby's wrist to ward off the evil eye. And every town had that one house no one walked past after dark. Sometimes it was a widow's house. Sometimes it was an abandoned mill. But always there were stories. In those stories, the dead didn't stay politely buried. They returned for unfinished business. And Halloween was their open door. You can almost picture it: oil lamps glowing in small wooden houses, families gathered close, the smell of cider and smoke in the air. Someone would lower their voice and say, "Do you remember the night old man Harker saw the white dog at the crossroads?" And the children would stop breathing, their eyes wide. That's how the night lived, half in shadow, half in imagination, held together by stories passed from one trembling voice to another. And while the adults told tales of banshees, witches, and wandering souls, the young ones dared each other to tempt fate. "Go look in the mirror by candlelight," they'd whisper. "Brush your hair 3 times, and you'll see the face of your future husband." Others roasted hazelnuts by the fire, giving each one a name. If a nut burned clean, the love would last. If it popped or cracked, heartbreak was near. Imagine the quiet giggles, the nervous glances, and the way the candlelight flickered over blushing faces. It wasn't just about ghosts. It was about the human hunger to know what waits beyond the veil of life, of love, of time. Outside, the night was restless. The wind played tricks, slamming shutters, rustling the dead cornfields, making people swear they heard voices whispering from the hedgerows. Lanterns flickered along dirt paths, and distant dogs barked at nothing. The air was thick with smoke from bonfires. Those fires were meant to keep evil spirits away, but people also believed the smoke itself carried blessings. Some even jumped through it for luck, shouting laughter into the dark. It was rough, reckless fun, the kind that came from living close to mystery and not needing it explained. In some towns, groups of boys, always boys, ran wild. They moved in packs with grins that gleamed like wolves. Mischief was tradition. They'd move gates, tip wagons, or switch horses between barns just to see confusion bloom by morning. The newspapers of 1890 complained every year, "Halloween rowdies strike again." But no one ever really stopped them. Deep down, people seemed to understand that on this night, a little chaos was expected. It was the world's brief permission to bend the rules, to let disorder have its dance, before order returned with the dawn. Still, not everyone laughed. Rural people, especially those far from town lights, treated Halloween like a sacred threshold. They left offerings on the doorstep: bread, milk, or apples for the wandering souls. If you forgot, superstition warned, your house might be visited by something that tapped at your window until you woke. Farmers sometimes found strange footprints in the frost the next morning, and that was enough to make even the toughest man mutter a prayer under his breath. Because the thing about superstition is it's not about believing in magic. It's about fearing what happens if you don't. In the small hours, when the fires died low and the laughter faded, there was a hush that settled across the countryside. That hush was the true soul of Halloween. Not horror, not excitement, but stillness awaiting. It was said that if you sat in silence by your hearth at midnight, you could hear your ancestors whispering advice in the crackle of the fire. And maybe that's why so many families in 1890 spoke softly that night. Because Halloween wasn't just about the dead coming back, it was about remembering that they were never gone. Even now, more than a century later, you can almost feel that quiet weight in the air every October. When the sky turns a strange orange-gray at dusk, and the wind slips through the trees like a sigh, it's not hard to imagine that somewhere, Those old lanterns still flicker, and those old voices still whisper. The past doesn't disappear. It lingers in rituals, in smells, in stories told by firelight. And maybe that's the heart of it. Halloween was never just one night of fear. It was a promise, a reminder that the veil between worlds is thin, and that remembering the old ways, even the strange ones, keep something sacred alive. So next time you carve a pumpkin or light a candle by the window, think of them. The farmers, the grandmothers, the children of 1,890, huddled in the glow of a single flame, whispering charms into the dark. Think of how they faced the unknown, not with dread, but with respect. And maybe that's what we've forgotten most in our modern Halloween. Beneath the costumes and candy, there was always reverence. A deep, quiet understanding that the night itself is alive, and that every flicker of light, every shadow on the wall, is part of an ancient conversation still unfolding. By the time midnight crept over those 1,890 hills, the world outside was both familiar and strange. A soft fog rolled across the fields, wrapping fences and apple trees in a shroud of gray. Horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, their breath turning into white clouds that hung heavy in the air. From the churchyard, the faint clang of a bell marked the hour 12 strokes, slow and solemn. To people back then, midnight wasn't just time, it was a boundary. The hour when prayers turned into protection, and when whispers might carry answers from the other side. In those quiet moments, homes across the countryside were alive with small, private rituals. You wouldn't have called them magic, at least not out loud, but they were. In one house, a woman stirred ashes in the hearth, searching for patterns that might reveal her fortune. In another, a young man tossed a pebble over his shoulder into the garden, believing that if it landed silently, the year ahead would bring him peace. Some hung bits of rowan wood above their doors. Others placed an iron nail under the bed to ward off spirits known to slip through cracks in the world when the night was darkest. Every family had its own way of keeping balance between the living and the unseen. But it wasn't all fear. Halloween, for people of 1,890, was also about connection. The dead weren't enemies to be banished, they were guests to be welcomed. That's why many homes left an extra plate on the table or kept a single candle burning in the window until dawn. It wasn't for decoration. It was a beacon. A quiet invitation for loved ones, long gone, to find their way home for one night. And maybe that's why the air felt so alive back then. Not haunted, but aware. You could almost sense the veil fluttering, like a curtain caught in a gentle breeze. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones out of respect, not fear. Even the roughest men took their hats off when passing a graveyard that night. There was a collective understanding, something ancient and unspoken, that Halloween wasn't about running from the dark, but listening to it. Meanwhile, in town squares and backyards, the energy was completely different. Halloween was a social event, a burst of chaos in an otherwise orderly year. Bonfires burned in empty lots. Fiddles played fast and wild. Couples danced on packed dirt, their shadows spinning in the firelight. Apple bobbing contests made everyone laugh until they coughed. And somewhere, a group of daring teenagers would sneak off to the edge of the woods, hoping to glimpse a ghost or each other in the dark. Old traditions mixed with new ones. Irish immigrants brought the turnip lanterns. Americans turned them into pumpkins. German families baked soul cakes. each one said to free a spirit from purgatory when eaten. Scottish folk told stories of the Slua, a host of restless souls that flew across the night sky like black birds. Some believed they'd swoop down to steal the dying. Others thought they were just lost travelers searching for a light to follow. Either way, every flicker of candle flame felt like both protection and promise. And if you stood on a village road around that time, let's say 1890, somewhere in the Midwest, you'd see a strange mix of sights. Children carrying carved lanterns that looked more grotesque than cute. Farmers in thick coats, sharing cider and swapping ghost stories. The local pastor pretending to disapprove, but secretly smiling. And behind all of it, the sound of wind moving through the cornfields, making the stalks whisper like voices that didn't quite fade. Superstition ran deep in those years. If a black cat crossed your path that night, you didn't chase it, you stepped back and whispered a quick prayer. If you heard footsteps behind you on an empty road, you didn't turn around until you reached a light. And if someone in the village died close to Halloween, people said the veil had opened a little early to guide them through. Still, not every superstition was solemn. There were love charms, too lots of them. In one tradition, girls would peel an apple in one long curl and toss it over their shoulder, hoping it would land in the shape of their future husband's initials. In another, they'd bake small cakes with rings hidden inside, and whoever found one was said to marry within the year. There was a sense of fun in it, but also belief, the kind that lets mystery feel safe, like a story you tell yourself and secretly hope might come true. But as the night wore on and laughter gave way to yawns, something shifted. The bonfires burned lower, and the streets emptied. Only the faint glow of lanterns and the sound of creaking signs in the wind remained. In that stillness, the other side of Halloween came back, the quiet part. The one filled with memory. That was when the older folks would sit by their windows and think of the ones they'd lost. A brother gone to war, a child taken by fever, a mother buried before her time. They didn't need seances or ghosts to feel their presence. The ache of remembrance was haunting enough. Some said the dead walked that night. Others said the living just remembered them more clearly. Either way, the result was the same, an invisible communion between past and present, between the ones who went before and those still carrying the torch. And maybe that's why the fires never fully went out. In the end, a Halloween night in 1890 wasn't about fear or even fun. It was about belonging. Every story, every superstition, every candle in a window was a way of saying, we are part of something bigger. Life didn't stop at the grave. It simply changed shape. And so, as the last embers of the fire dimmed and the wind settled into a sigh, people closed their doors not with dread, but gratitude. By the time the first hours of morning hinted at the horizon, the Halloween night of 1890 had become something close to a dream. Strange, beautiful, and full of quiet meaning. The fog still clung to the ground, but the fires were dying, and the laughter had softened into whispers. The people who stayed up late, farmers, mothers, old men, sat near their windows, their faces lit by the faint glow of candles that had burned all night long. They weren't keeping watch for danger. They were keeping company with memory. You see, in that time, death wasn't an ending that people feared. It was a passage, a doorway to be treated with care. Families spoke of their dead as if they still lived nearby, just on the other side of the veil. Every year, on this night, they believed that veil thinned letting loved ones slip through for a visit. Some left out bread and butter, or a cup of cider, for the ones who travel between. Others whispered greetings into the cold air before bed, trusting the message would be heard. And if a candle flickered suddenly, or the old floorboards creaked without reason, no one screamed or ran. They smiled, because maybe, just maybe, someone had come home. Out in the countryside, small fires still burned in iron pots, left at crossroads. Travelers passing through would stop, warm their hands, and sometimes drop a coin or a piece of bread into the embers. It was an old belief, older than the villages themselves, an offering to the wandering dead so they would not lose their way or trouble the living. The roads were dark then, the fields endless, and superstition was simply another word for respect. In one house, a young woman sat quietly by the fire, turning a mirror toward the flame. It was said that if you looked into it on Halloween night, at the stroke of 12, you might see the face of your future husband behind your own. She stared long enough for her eyes to water, but all she saw was her reflection framed in firelight. And yet, the next morning, she swore she'd seen a flicker of something more, a shadow, a promise. In another cottage, an old widow placed 3 apples by the window, one for the living, one for the dead, and one for the spirits that guarded her home. Before sleeping, she whispered a prayer that sounded less like fear and more like gratitude. Gratitude for another year survived, another harvest gathered, another night of balance between the seen and unseen. By then, the wind outside had softened, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, damp leaves, and something sweet, perhaps cider, perhaps memory. The moon hung low, pale and worn, like an old coin rubbed thin by too many hands. The village streets were silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a sign in the breeze. And above it all, the stars blinked faintly through the thinning fog, patient and eternal. It's easy to forget how close people once lived to mystery. There were no electric lights, no buzzing distractions to fill the silence. The world felt alive in a way ours rarely does now. Every gust of wind had a presence. Every sound in the dark carried meaning. And Halloween wasn't about costumes or candy, it was about listening. Listening to the house breathe, to the fields settle, to the small voices of superstition that whispered, "Be still, be kind, and the night will pass gently." That balance mattered, because for all their rituals and stories, people in 1890 understood something we've mostly lost, that fear fades when it's met with respect. They didn't try to erase the unknown, they gave it a place at the table. That's why, long after the last lantern was blown out, a single candle often stayed burning in the window until dawn. And if you'd been there walking through a village street just before sunrise, you'd have seen that soft glow flickering through shutters and curtains, one after another, house after house. It wasn't light enough to guide a traveler, but bright enough to send a message to the dark. We see you, we honor you, and we are not afraid. Then, as dawn finally came, the gray light of morning began to stretch across the sky. The fog lifted. The smell of ash and cider faded into the crisp scent of cold air and wet soil. The dead, it was said, would return to their rest by the time the first rooster crowed. So families rose quietly, whispered one last good night to the unseen, and went about their day as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The world had turned through another threshold. Life had brushed against death, and everyone had felt it softly, respectfully, like a curtain stirring in the wind. Years later, people would talk about that feeling as if it were only superstition. But the truth is, it was never really about ghosts. It was about presence, about remembering that life itself is fragile and miraculous, balanced between what we can touch and what we can only imagine. That's what Halloween meant in 1890. A night to face the dark, not with terror, but with care. To share warmth with neighbors, honor those who came before, and listen, really listen, to the hum of a living world that never truly sleeps. So as the last candle burned low, and the smoke curled into the pale dawn, the people of that little town did what they always did. They stirred the ashes, swept the hearth, and whispered a quiet thank you to the night that had passed peacefully once more. By the time the sun had fully climbed over the horizon, the Halloween of 1890 had already faded into something soft and ghost-like, a story that lingered in the air long after the candles had gone cold. Villagers stepped outside their homes, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their breath turning white in the brisk morning air. The smell of smoke and damp earth still hung over the fields, mingling with the faint sweetness of cider left out overnight. Children ran barefoot down the muddy paths, chasing each other past pumpkins that had begun to sag in the chill. Their laughter was bright, piercing the quiet in a way that felt almost defiant, as if joy itself were a way of keeping the dark at bay. They didn't understand the weight of the night before, the prayers, the rituals, the soft hush that had fallen over their parents' voices. But they carried it forward anyway, without realizing it. Tradition often survives that way through play, through small gestures that mean more than they know. At the village edge, an old man in a wool coat knelt by a blackened firepot, stirring the ashes from last night's offering. He found a coin half buried in the soot and held it up to the morning light, nodding quietly to himself. "They passed through," he muttered, "and they left us in peace." He dropped the coin into his pocket, not for luck, but for memory. Inside the cottages, mothers swept the floors where ash had settled from the hearths, whispering soft thanks as they brushed it away. A few burned bundles of dried sage again, just to be sure the air stayed clean and kind. The youngest children were sent to fetch water, their metal pails clanging softly in the stillness, echoing through the crisp morning like tiny bells. Breakfasts were simple: porridge, brown bread, maybe an apple saved from the harvest, but they felt heavier with meaning. The night had passed quietly. No spirits stirred. No omens troubled the village. For people in 1890, that was proof that the rituals had worked. Respect had been given, balance restored. But not every place woke in peace. In a farmhouse farther down the road, a woman found her candle still burning faintly in the window. The wax had melted into strange shapes, forming something that looked almost like a face. She stared for a long time before blowing it out, her heart caught between awe and unease. To her, it wasn't frightening, it was a message. A reminder that something unseen had indeed brushed by her home in the night, seen her light, and moved on. That was how most people saw the world back then, not divided into superstition and fact, but woven together in quiet harmony. A farmer could believe in both God and ghosts, in both good soil and good luck. The line between the natural and the spiritual was thin, like the morning mist still clinging to the fields. By midday, the town square came alive again. Women hung laundry that gleamed white in the pale autumn Sunday. Men repaired fences, their hands rough but steady. The night's strangeness had already begun to feel distant, but its calm, its gentleness, still lingered like the echo of a song. Children gathered at the well, swapping stories they'd overheard. That a shadow had been seen walking along the old road, that someone's mirror had cracked after midnight, that a barn door had opened by itself. None of it frightened them. It thrilled them. Halloween wasn't a nightmare to be feared. It was proof that the world was still alive with wonder. And as the day wore on, even the skeptics, the ones who rolled their eyes at talk of spirits and omens, would catch themselves glancing over their shoulders as the sun began to fall again, just to be sure. Because deep down, even the most practical souls of 1890 knew something that science can't quite explain, that every so often, the veil between worlds feels thinner. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's simply the way humans have always needed to give shape to the unknown. But that need to respect, to listen, to wonder, was what gave Halloween its strange power. As twilight crept back over the fields, the first lamps were lit again, not out of fear, but habit. The flicker of flame was comforting, a small promise that light would always return, no matter how long the night. In one cottage, the grandmother who had spent the whole evening whispering prayers now sat quietly by her hearth, a cup of cider warming her hands. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The calm in her eyes said it all. The night had passed. The balance held. Outside, the last of the turnip lanterns still sat on fences and windowsills, their crooked grins dim but enduring. Children poked at them with sticks, laughing, unaware that they were playing with one of the oldest symbols of the night, the watchful light meant to guide wandering souls home. The year would turn, as it always did. Winter would come, bringing frost to the fields and silence to the orchards. The people would carry on with their work, their prayers, their small rituals. But when the next Halloween came, they would do it all again, not because they were afraid of ghosts, but because they still remembered. They remembered that once a year, for one long night, the living and the dead shared the same world. They remembered that even in darkness, warmth and kindness had power. And above all, they remembered that no matter how much the world changed, some things, candles, prayers, the gentle hum of an autumn night were worth keeping alive. By the next evening, a faint mist had rolled down from the hills, wrapping the village in a veil of pale silver. It was October's last breath, the kind of night that carried the weight of endings, soft and slow. The air smelled of rain-soaked hay, cider pressed too long, and the faint metallic tang of frost creeping into the soil. The lanterns that had been left out the night before were now only husks, their carved grins sagging inward. Still, a few flickered faintly, stubborn little fires against the damp. The old tradition said the night after Halloween, All Souls' Night, belonged not to trickery, but to memory. It was when prayers replaced whispers, when the villagers gathered to remember those who had gone before. Even the children were quieter that evening, walking beside their parents to the churchyard, their boots crunching through damp leaves. The bell tolled slow and low, echoing over the valley like the heartbeat of the year itself. Inside the church, the scent of candle wax mingled with cold stone and damp wool. The pews filled with families, each clutching small tokens, a photograph, a lock of hair, a scrap of ribbon, even a piece of bread left from last night's supper. These weren't offerings to the dead, not exactly. They were reminders, anchors to a life once shared. The minister's voice rose softly above the crackling of the fire in the small iron stove. "We light these candles not to chase away the dark," he said, "but to invite peace into it." And as the wicks caught, one by one, the room filled with golden light, not bright, but alive. It shimmered over faces lined with years, over small hands folded in laps, over eyes that glistened quietly in the glow. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the churchyard fence. The old oaks loomed like patient sentinels, their branches heavy with moisture. Somewhere in the fog, a fox barked once, its sharp cry splitting the stillness. A dog answered from far away, and then silence returned, not fearful, but deep, like the pause between heartbeats. When the prayers ended, the people didn't rush to leave. They lingered, speaking in low voices, as though any loud sound might break the spell of gentleness that filled the air. The children were given small cakes, soul cakes, round and golden, marked with simple crosses. They were told to eat one for someone they loved who had passed. "One cake, one prayer," the grandmother said softly, pressing a warm piece into her grandson's hand. "That's how we remember." Outside, the fog had turned the world into a dream. The flicker of lanterns on the road looked like floating stars, and the shapes of people blurred into silhouettes. The villagers walked home together, their footsteps muffled by wet leaves, their breath curling like smoke in the chill. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence carried meaning, gratitude, memory, and perhaps a little wonder at how close the past still felt. In one small cottage at the far edge of the village, an old woman sat by her window watching the mist. She had lost her husband 20 years before, and every All Souls night she left his cup of cider on the table. It was still full this year, the golden liquid catching the faint light of the fire. She smiled softly and whispered, "You always did love the smell of apples." Then she raised her own cup, took a slow sip, and let the quiet settle around her like a familiar blanket. Outside, the orchard stood silent, trees black against the pale fog, leaves heavy with dew. The air was so still that even the smallest sound felt alive. The drip of water from a branch, the faint pop of cooling embers, the quiet breath of the earth itself. The villagers believed the dead walked gently among them on nights like this, not to haunt, but to visit. And so they left doors unlatched, candles burning low, and bread on the table. It wasn't fear, it was hospitality. The young ones didn't understand, not yet. To them, it was simply a strange ritual. Lights, food, stories. But when they grew older, they'd remember how the air had felt on this night. They'd remember the warmth of hands held in the dark, the flicker of candlelight against misty glass, the smell of earth and smoke and sweetness. And one day, they'd pass it on. By midnight, the fog began to lift, revealing the fields glistening under a faint frost. The stars peeked through, one by one, timid but clear. The village seemed to exhale, the tension of the old year giving way to calm. From a distance, the cottages looked like small beacons, warm, glowing hearts in the vast quiet of the countryside. Inside those homes, families slept soundly. The fires burned low, their embers glowing like watchful eyes. The last candles flickered and went out. But something, a feeling, a promise, lingered in the air, soft as breath. The people of 1890 didn't have much. Their world was smaller, slower, shaped by hands and seasons and faith. But they had something most of us forget, a sense of belonging to the night as much as to the day. They didn't fight the darkness. They lit it gently, respected it, and let it be part of the story. By the time morning arrived, the mist had vanished, leaving behind a sheen of frost that glittered across the fields like powdered glass. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and every breath came out as a pale cloud. Roosters crowed somewhere down the lane, breaking the stillness of dawn. The village, once cloaked in fog and superstition, woke to a world that looked newly washed, quiet, clean, and bright in the low Sunday. But inside the cottages, the warmth still clung. Ashes smoldered in hearths, and the smell of wood smoke drifted lazily beneath the beams. Mothers stirred porridge over crackling fires, their hands red from the cold, while children huddled beneath wool blankets, reluctant to leave the comfort of the night behind. The All Souls candles had burned down to soft wax puddles, their last flickers leaving faint halos on wooden tables. Yet even as the sun climbed higher, the whispers of Halloween lingered. The children still swapped stories at breakfast, of footsteps in the orchard, of shadowy figures glimpsed through mist, of lanterns that flickered long after their candles should have died. Most adults smiled indulgently, but not dismissively. They knew better than to mock what had been honored for generations. In their hearts, they carried quiet respect, not for ghosts, but for the delicate balance between the living and the remembered. At the far edge of the village, the church bell rang again, softer this time. The minister stood by the door, greeting those who came to help clean the graveyard paths. It was tradition to sweep away the leaves after the souls had passed, as a gesture of gratitude for their visit. Old men with aching knees bent to lift branches, while the younger ones hauled away the damp heaps. The frost crunched beneath their boots, and their breath rose in small puffs of white. Near the fence, a boy knelt beside a weathered headstone and brushed the frost from the engraved name. "She was my grandmother," he said quietly, to no one in particular. His father nodded, placing a small candle beside the stone. "She'd be proud of you," he said simply. There was no need for more. The silence between them was enough. By noon, the village road had come alive again, carts creaking under sacks of grain, dogs barking at the noise, women carrying baskets of bread still steaming from their ovens. The mist of the night before had become nothing more than a story, but its quiet power still pulsed under the surface. It was in the way people greeted one another with softer voices, or paused a little longer when passing the churchyard, as if acknowledging unseen company. Down by the orchard, where the ground was still damp and the air smelled faintly of apples, a few children lingered near the trees. They poked at the hollow turnips left from Halloween, now wilted and slumped like old faces. "They look sad," one little girl said. "Maybe they're tired," another replied. Their teacher, walking by on her way to the schoolhouse, smiled. "Even lights need to rest," she told them. "But remember, it's our job to keep them burning when the night comes again." As afternoon turned to dusk, a chill wind swept through the village, rattling the shutters and sending a ripple across the drying laundry lines. The scent of wood smoke thickened once more, rising from every chimney. Inside, lamps were lit early, not out of fear but habit. It was the kind of small, inherited gesture that tied one generation to the next. Old Mrs. Hayward, who had lived through more Octobers than anyone else in the valley, sat near her hearth mending socks. "You know," she said to her visiting niece, "when I was a girl, we used to believe that on All Hallows, the dead walked the roads just like us, only they couldn't be seen unless they wanted to. And if your house was warm and your heart was kind, they'd stop by for a moment of rest." Her niece laughed softly. "And if it wasn't?" Mrs. Hayward smiled without looking up. Then they kept walking. The old woman set her mending aside and stirred the fire with an iron poker. Sparks rose, glowing gold before vanishing up the chimney. "But I always thought that wasn't about fear at all," she added. "It was about kindness. Even the unseen deserve a bit of warmth." Outside, the last light of day slipped behind the hills, leaving the sky streaked with violet and smoke-gray clouds. The first star appeared, sharp and cold, hanging over the church steeple. The road grew quiet again, save for the distant creak of a cart heading home and the faint toll of the evening bell. In the cottages, families gathered once more around their tables. Supper was simple bread, cheese, maybe a bit of stew left from the night before, but there was a deep comfort in the familiar rhythm. Children yawned, mothers hummed, fathers poured cider into wooden cups. The firelight flickered over tired faces, softening them into peace. And when the candles were finally snuffed and the rooms went dark, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of gratitude, of the strange, quiet magic that still lingered from Halloween's passing. The old traditions of 1890 may seem distant now, but they carried something we've almost forgotten. A belief that even in the coldest, darkest night, warmth can be shared between the living, the dead, and the stories that keep them both alive. By the next evening, as twilight bled once again across the horizon, the village had begun to hum with a softer, more familiar rhythm. The night after Halloween was quieter, but not without its secrets. The candles may have burned out, yet their scent still clung to the wooden beams and woven curtains, as if refusing to let the spirits go completely. Even the wind carried a faint echo of the laughter and whispers from the night before, curling through the streets like memory itself. Children gathered near the edge of the village green, trading the last of their roasted nuts and toffee apples. Their cheeks were flushed from the cold, and their voices drifted through the dusk in small bursts of excitement. "Did you hear the bell last night?" one boy asked, wide-eyed. "It rang once, but no one was there." Another swore he'd seen a shadow move through the orchard long after the fires had died. The adults pretended not to listen, but their hands, busy mending nets or stirring stews, moved a little slower than usual. Inside the cottages, people began speaking of the old customs, not the frightening ones, but the small acts of care that made Halloween what it once was. A girl's mother might set out a slice of bread and a bowl of milk on the doorstep, whispering that it was for the travelers who couldn't find their way home. In another house, a farmer's wife stirred ashes into a neat circle on the hearth, believing it would catch the footprints of visiting spirits. Some still checked for those marks in the morning, and though most found none, a few claimed they did. Old Mrs. Hayward, always the storyteller, told her visiting niece that in her youth, people used to scry by candlelight, gazing into bowls of water or mirrors on All Hallows Eve, hoping to see a vision of the future. They said if you were brave enough, she whispered, you might catch a glimpse of the one you were meant to marry. But only if your heart was steady and your candle didn't flicker. Her niece shivered with delight and leaned closer, half afraid, half hoping for more. The truth was, every generation softened the stories a little. What once carried fear, now carried memory. The spirits that were once to be warded off had become something gentler, visitors to be honored, ancestors to be remembered. And that was the quiet magic of 1890. Life and superstition walking hand in hand, neither quite separate from the other. As the evening deepened, the smell of peat smoke rose again through the air, and one by one, small pinpricks of light appeared in cottage windows. Inside one of those homes, the McAllister family sat together near the fire. The father polished his boots, the mother knitted, and the children, 3 of them, huddled close, still buzzing from the excitement of the holiday. "Tell it again," the eldest begged. "About the lantern man." The father smiled, pretending to protest, but there was pride in his voice when he began. "Long ago," he said, "there was a man who walked the roads on Halloween night with a single lantern carved from a turnip. He wasn't evil, just lonely. He'd lost his way one dark autumn, and ever since, he wanders between worlds, looking for a home that remembers him. That's why we leave our lights burning, so no one ever has to wander in the dark again." The youngest gasped, clutching her. "Blanket, does he still walk now?" Her mother smiled softly. "Only if you forget to be kind," she said. The family laughed together, the sound warm and bright against the hum of the fire. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the shutters, and for a moment it seemed to echo the rhythm of their laughter, as if something in the night was smiling too. Further down the lane, the blacksmith's forge stood silent, its coals still faintly red. The man himself sat on a wooden stool, staring into the embers. His wife had died 2 winters before, and though he never said much, every year on this night he lit an extra lantern on the windowsill. It wasn't for decoration. It was a quiet invitation, a message carried by light. "Come by if you can," he would murmur softly. "The fire's still warm, and maybe it was just imagination, or maybe not. But sometimes the coals in the forge flared brighter for a moment, as though answering." By midnight, the roads were empty again. The frost crept back across the fields, coating every blade of grass in pale silver. The moon hung low and cold, illuminating the worn fences and bare branches with a soft, ghostly glow. The village was utterly still, yet not silent. The faintest sounds lingered: the sigh of the wind through the orchard, the creak of a shutter, the last crackle of a dying fire. Somewhere in that quiet, a candle still flickered in an upstairs window. Perhaps it had been left by mistake, or perhaps someone had chosen to let it burn just a little longer. One final offering to the night, a reminder that even when Halloween had passed, its spirit endured. And as the hours slipped toward dawn, the world held its breath. The line between the living and the remembered began to fade again, not through fear, but through peace. For the people of 1890, Halloween wasn't about monsters or mischief. It was about connection, the fragile, eternal thread between now and what came before. Maybe that's why, even now, when we carve pumpkins instead of turnips, and hang paper ghosts instead of lighting real candles, the feeling lingers. Maybe Somewhere deep down, we still remember the warmth of that little cottage fire, the hum of old prayers, the taste of honey and smoke, and the quiet belief that on one special night, the past comes home to visit. By the time dawn crept back over the hills, a soft frost had already kissed the rooftops. The village looked almost untouched, as if Halloween had been nothing but a dream that the world itself was reluctant to wake from. But step closer and you'd see faint traces left behind, footprints in the damp earth, candle wax hardened along the stones, the half-burned wick of a lantern still clinging to its last curl of smoke. In the cottage kitchens, kettles hissed and clattered back to life. The mothers who had whispered prayers only hours ago now stirred porridge, humming softly, their songs lingering with the rhythm of what they had seen or what they thought they'd seen. There was no fear in their eyes, just a kind of reverence, like they'd touched something ancient and were still carrying its warmth. Children, bleary-eyed but brimming with stories, recounted the night in bursts between spoonfuls of breakfast. "I swear, I saw something move near the orchard," one said, and the lantern light went dim. Another insisted she'd heard footsteps on the roof. No one mocked them. In 1890, belief wasn't a thing to be laughed at. It was part of the air you breathed, invisible, necessary, and deeply woven into life. Out in the fields, the men worked slowly that morning. Their breath came out in clouds, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. One paused near a row of turnips, eyes catching the faint imprint of a child's hand, in the frost small, perfect, and already fading. He smiled quietly and whispered something no one else heard before bending back to work. As the sun climbed higher, the fog began to lift from the valley, and with it came a sense of renewal, the comforting thought that the night had passed peacefully, that the world was once again solid, predictable, and human. But even in that safety, superstition still lingered. The women would sweep the ashes from the hearth carefully, never before sunrise, and always in silence. To disturb the ashes too soon, they said, was to invite a spirit to linger longer than it should. In one corner cottage, a grandmother with silver hair and sharp eyes hung a small sprig of rowan above the door. "It keeps the night from staying," she told her granddaughter, "and it reminds the morning to come quickly next year." The little girl nodded solemnly, holding the twine as her grandmother tied the knot with fingers that had known a lifetime of rituals. For the people of that age, the line between faith and folklore was not a straight one. They prayed, but they also believed in signs, the way the wind turned at dawn, the way a candle flickered when no one was near, or how a loaf of bread cracked in the oven. Each moment, however small, felt connected to something larger, something ancient and watching. By afternoon, the village seemed to return to its normal rhythm. Horses' hooves echoed along the dirt road. Women traded gossip over fence lines, and the baker's boy shouted cheerfully as he carried loaves fresh from the oven. But beneath the chatter, there was still a hush, a softness that only comes after a night when the living and the dead had shared the same breath of air. At the blacksmith's forge, the man who'd lit a lantern for his late wife was back at work. Sparks flew from his hammer as it struck the anvil, and though his face was marked with soot, there was something gentler in his expression that morning. The flame that roared in the forge seemed to move differently, slower, more alive, as if it had listened to his quiet midnight wish. Across the road, the church bell tolled once not for a service, but simply because the wind had caught the rope. Still, it made a few villagers glance toward the steeple, half expecting to see something perched there that wasn't quite bird nor cloud. When nothing appeared, they nodded to themselves and went back to work. But one man quietly crossed himself anyway. That evening, as the sun began to set once more, the village took on that golden, haunting glow that comes only at the end of October. The light slanted low through the trees, catching on the wet branches and turning them to glass. The air smelled of damp wood, horsehair, and distant fires. At the edge of the orchard, where the grass still held the faint scent of smoke, two children crouched by the fence. They had carved a tiny lantern from the last turnip of the season, crooked, imperfect, but proudly theirs. They lit it with a stub of candle, shielding it from the wind. The flame flickered weakly, then steadied. "Do you think they can still see us?" the younger one asked. The older shrugged. "Maybe, but it's good manners to say thank you, even if you can't see who you're talking to." They sat in silence for a while, the little flame glowing between them, until their mother's voice called them home through the dusk. When they left, the lantern stayed behind, its crooked smile shining faintly in the growing dark, a small, brave echo of the night before. In time, that simple gesture became tradition. Each year, someone, no one ever said, who would leave a small carved lantern near the orchard fence after Halloween, just as the children had done. Some called it superstition, others called it respect, but everyone, whether they admitted it or not, took comfort knowing that somewhere between the living and the remembered, a light was still burning. And maybe that's what made those old autumn nights so unforgettable. They weren't just about ghosts or games, but about gratitude, the quiet promise that warmth, once shared, never truly goes out. As November's chill settled deeper into the soil, life in the village began to change. The fields were bare now, the last turnips and potatoes tucked safely away, and smoke rose steadily from every chimney, like small, stubborn prayers against the coming frost. Halloween had passed, but its echo lingered in whispers, in gestures, in the way people looked over their shoulders when walking home after sunset. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The sense that something had brushed close, something patient and invisible, now retreating into the long sleep of winter. Farmers left small offerings at the edge of their fields, a crust of bread, a few drops of ale, even a coin pressed into the soil, not out of fear, but courtesy. After all, what harm could come from showing respect to the unseen? Inside the cottages, warmth had become a kind of worship. Families gathered around their hearths, not just for heat, but for protection. Fire, in 1890, was the one thing that stood between the living and whatever waited in the dark. Every flame was a guardian, a reminder that life, for all its fragility, could still push back against the cold and the unknown. Grandmothers kept the ashes from Halloween night, wrapping them carefully in cloth and tucking them above the doorframe. "It keeps mischief out," they'd say, "and blessings in." Some would even mix those ashes with a pinch of salt and scatter it beneath the bed, a quiet ritual to calm dreams and guard the sleeping. It was strange, maybe, but back then, nothing was just folklore. Every superstition carried the weight of generations who had tested, believed, and passed it on. Outside, the world grew quieter. The orchard that once hummed with whispers now stood still, branches black against the pale morning sky. Frost covered everything, fences, grass, even the smallest footprints of the children who had left their lanterns the night before. Yet, in the silence, there was beauty. Each frozen stem glittered like glass. Each breath hung in the air like smoke from a ghostly candle. In the village churchyard, a few candles still flickered on graves. No one knew who lit them, maybe family, maybe someone just passing through, but no one dared blow them out. Let the dead have their light, people said. It cost the living nothing. Sometimes, though, strange things followed the festival. A farmer might wake to find his tools rearranged, as if borrowed by unseen hands. A baker's fire might refuse to light, only to flare up again when a cross was traced in the air. And once, a woman swore she saw her late husband's reflection in the window, not frightening, just standing there, smiling faintly, as though checking that she was all right before fading into the fog. Stories like that spread quickly, but they weren't told to scare. They were reminders that the world was bigger than reason, that love, memory, and mystery had their own laws. The local children loved to collect these tales. They'd sit on the stone wall after chores, daring each other to visit the orchard after dark, or to knock on the old mill door where a ghostly bell was said to ring each Halloween. Most never got far. Fear wasn't the problem. The cold was. Frost crept into their boots faster than courage could thaw it. Yet every year, one or two would claim they'd seen something. A flicker of light in the trees. A shadow walking against the wind. A soft hum carried on the night air, like the echo of an old lullaby. And when they ran home, breathless and grinning, their parents would just smile. "The night's kind to those who don't mock it," they'd say. That was the balance of those times: fear and respect, life and memory, all woven together like smoke and flame. People didn't need horror stories to believe in spirits. They lived with them. Every candle lit, every door closed softly, every whispered blessing before sleep, these were small conversations with the unseen. And though the years rolled forward, the traditions didn't die. They changed shape. The carved turnip lanterns became pumpkins. The quiet vigils became neighborhood parties. The prayers became laughter. But if you listen closely, really listen, you can still feel the heartbeat of that old superstition beneath the fun. It's in the way children pause before blowing out a candle. It's in the hush that sometimes falls between songs on Halloween night, when the world itself seems to listen. So maybe the people of 1890 weren't so different from us. They just knew how to see the invisible, how to treat the unknown with both wonder and care. And perhaps that's the lesson their strange rituals still whisper to us today, that not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are simply meant to be honored. By the late 19th century, Halloween had evolved into something both eerie and romantic. In towns from Ireland to rural America, it was called Nutcrack Night, Snapapple Night, or Colcannon Eve. Every region had its own twist, but they all shared one purpose: to glimpse what the next year might bring, especially in love and luck. Victorian superstition turned Halloween into the perfect stage for divination. The night was believed to blur boundaries between past and future, life and death, and even between hearts. Young women, in particular, were told that if they performed the right rituals, they could see the face of the man they would one day marry. In one common ritual, a girl would sit alone at midnight, holding a mirror by candlelight. She'd peel an apple in a single unbroken strip, and toss the peel over her shoulder. When she turned back, she might see the reflection of her future husband appear behind her, or so the legend said. But if the candle flickered out before she finished, it meant something darker. The spirit world had noticed, and her fate was better left unseen. There was also the bowl of water test. Girls would drop hazelnuts into the fire, each one named for a potential suitor. If the nut burned brightly, the match would be happy. If it sputtered, cracked, or jumped away, that man was trouble. People laughed, of course, but still, when the fire popped, every girl's heart skipped a beat. Halloween in those days wasn't just spooky, it was deeply personal. The night carried a sense of vulnerability. Maybe it was because life itself was fragile. Medicine was uncertain. Winter was hard. Death was close. So people used these old rituals to bring meaning to uncertainty. A game of fortune-telling wasn't just fun, it was hope disguised as folklore. Even the food told stories. In Ireland, families made barmbrack, a sweet bread filled with raisins, spices, and hidden charms. Each charm meant something: a ring for marriage, a coin for prosperity, a thimble for independence, and a piece of cloth for struggle ahead. Everyone took a slice, waiting for the symbol that would define their next year. When someone found the ring, laughter would fill the room, half joy, half nervous relief. But not every tradition was playful. In Scotland, it was said that if you roasted a chestnut in silence and thought of someone who had passed, their spirit might send you a sign, a faint knock, a whisper, a shift in candlelight. Nothing loud, nothing frightening, just enough to remind the living that love didn't end with the grave. Victorians had a fascination with death, but not in the morbid way we imagine today. They saw it as part of a grand, mysterious cycle. That's why Halloween in 1890 was often as much about remembrance as fear. Families visited graveyards, cleaned headstones, and left small lanterns burning overnight, not to summon spirits, but to guide them home. Some believed that the dead visited not to haunt, but to bless, to ensure that their loved ones were protected through winter. Children were told to leave a bit of food by the window, just in case a wandering soul was hungry. A spoonful of porridge, a crust of bread, a bit of butter, small offerings, humble but sincere. And then there was the sound, the quiet rustle of the autumn wind through trees, the far-off bark of a dog, the faint creak of the house settling. Victorians listened to those sounds differently than we do now. To them, every creak had meaning. Every gust of wind carried a whisper. It wasn't paranoia. It was participation, the belief that the world around you was alive and responsive if you had the patience to listen. In small towns across America, these old European customs mingled with new ones. Immigrants brought their folklore, and soon, pumpkin carving replaced the grim turnip lanterns of old. The grinning faces weren't just decoration, they were protection. The carved light was meant to ward off mischievous spirits who might try to cross the threshold. People placed them on windowsills, porches, and even church steps, creating a flickering barrier between safety and shadow. As the century turned, newspapers began publishing stories about these strange country rituals, half mocking, half fascinated. They called it quaint, rustic, a ghost of old Europe. But for the people living it, it was never quaint. It was their way of keeping balance between laughter and reverence, life and memory. Imagine it, the soft crackle of the fire, the flicker of lanterns, The murmur of voices sharing ghost stories while apples bobbed in a wooden tub nearby. Someone strums a fiddle. Someone else tells a tale of a spectral horse that walks the moors, its hooves never touching the ground. The children giggle, then fall quiet as the story deepens. And for a moment, everyone feels it, that electric stillness that lives only on Halloween, when time itself feels thinner, as if history and the present are breathing in the same air. In that candlelit glow, superstition wasn't a superstition at all. It was belonging. It was a way of facing what couldn't be explained with open eyes and steady hearts. And maybe, in a world lit only by fire and hope, that was the only way to live, by believing that every mystery, no matter how strange, carried meaning. By the late Victorian era, the fear of ghosts wasn't just whispered about by firelight. It was photographed, tested, and performed. The 1,890 seconds were an age of electricity and illusion, of both logic and longing. People no longer gathered only to play fortune-telling games or carve turnip lanterns. They gathered to speak to the dead. Spiritualism was sweeping across America and Europe. Mediums, most of them women, hosted seances in drawing rooms lit by flickering candles. The rich and the grieving would arrive in mourning black, clutching a locket or a photograph, and sit around a small wooden table. The medium would close her eyes, whisper a prayer, and wait for the knock. Sometimes it came from the table itself, trembling under unseen hands. Sometimes it came from the walls, soft as a heartbeat. Skeptics called it theater. Believers called it proof. And for the Victorians, it was something in between. The seance wasn't just a performance, it was a reflection of their times. The Civil War and industrial expansion had changed everything. Families were broken, life moved faster, and death became both closer and more abstract. They needed connection, even if it came from beyond the veil. It's strange, isn't it? The same people who built railroads, invented telegraphs, and electrified cities were also asking ghosts for advice. The Victorians were obsessed with invisible forces, whether it was electricity, magnetism, or the soul. They saw no contradiction in believing in both. To them, science and spirit were part of the same mystery, and that's where photography came in. In 1891, spiritual photographers began producing images of spirit forms, faint, misty silhouettes hovering near their living relatives. Sometimes the figures were transparent, their faces serene. Other times, they were childlike, almost angelic. To us, it looks like exposure tricks and double negatives. But to people grieving after years of plague, war, and hardship, those photos were small miracles. They looked at those blurred figures and whispered, "She's still here." Halloween became the perfect night to blur those lines further. In towns from Boston to Belfast, people began holding ghost nights, where parlors were draped in black cloth and mirrors were covered. A single candle burned in the center of the room. Guests would test their bravery by walking through in silence, daring the spirits to make their presence known. And for the first time, Halloween was becoming social, less about superstition in secret and more about shared wonder. That's when phantasmagoria shows began to spread. Traveling illusionists used lanterns, mirrors, and smoke to project moving ghosts onto walls. People gasped, screamed, and then laughed, the way we do now in haunted houses. The supernatural had become entertainment, but beneath the laughter, the old reverence remained. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, In small rural communities, the old ways persisted. Children still carried carved lanterns through foggy streets, singing songs to ward off wandering spirits. Housewives still left offerings of bread and milk by the hearth, and in the quiet corners of villages, grandmothers still whispered blessings over embers, just as they had for generations. But in the cities, the cities were changing fast. Electricity lit up the night. Stores began selling paper ghosts, cardboard bats, and witches' hats for parties. Newspapers printed Halloween menus, with pumpkin pies, roasted chestnuts, and witch cakes flavored with molasses. The line between the sacred and the playful began to blur. And yet, under all that laughter and candlelight, people still paused to wonder, what if the spirits really did visit tonight? Imagine an 1,890 seconds parlor. The wallpaper is deep crimson, the air thick with the smell of wax and coal smoke. A group of guests sits in a circle, hands joined. The medium, a woman with sharp eyes and trembling fingers, tilts her head as the room grows colder. A candle flickers, and for a heartbeat, everyone sees it a shape in the glass. Pale, wavering, gone in a blink. A collective breath holds. Then someone laughs nervously, because what else can you do when the unseen world reminds you it's watching? These gatherings were everywhere, not just in homes, but in churches, theaters, and secret societies. Mediums became celebrities. Ghost stories filled newspapers. Halloween, once a humble night of superstition and harvest thanks, had become something far larger, a stage for the imagination. By 1895, Halloween parties were being held in schools and town halls. People came dressed as ghosts, devils, or fairies, not to mock the spirit world, but to dance with it. The costumes weren't store-bought polyester. They were homemade masterpieces of lace, feathers, and candle soot. Each mask was a symbol, a little rebellion against death itself. Still, in the countryside, the old fears lingered. Farmers swore they saw lights in the bogs or heard knocking in the stables at midnight. Women placed iron scissors under their pillows to keep away witches. And in some homes, families covered their mirrors on Halloween night so wandering spirits wouldn't mistake them for doorways. But perhaps the strangest part of that era was how beauty and fear coexisted. Halloween in 1890 wasn't grotesque or gory. It was poetic, a dance of light and shadow. The rituals weren't about scaring people. They were about remembering. Every candle lit for the dead, every whisper into the dark, carried love at its core. And that's what modern Halloween often forgets. Beneath the candy, costumes, and haunted houses lies something tender, a human need to face what's unseen and say, "We remember you. We're still here." As midnight deepened in those long ago nights, the last candles would flicker out. The old women would whisper one final prayer. The children would drift to sleep, and the wind outside would carry the echoes of laughter and whispers through the orchards. The living and the dead, the hopeful and the haunted, all sharing one night of peace before the long winter set in. By 1900, America was changing fast. The farms that once held quiet Halloween rituals were giving way to small towns, buzzing with railroads, factories, and electric lights. Immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany brought their folk traditions with them: jack-o'-lanterns, mischief, and ghost lore. and these began to blend into something uniquely American. But unlike the quiet, candlelit nights of the Victorian countryside, Halloween in the cities was loud. Children didn't whisper prayers for the dead, they shouted through the streets. They banged pots, rang bells, and knocked on doors, not for offerings to spirits, but for candy and coins. The ancient Samhain fires had become streetlights, and the mischief had become play. Yet, even amid the noise, old habits persisted. Housewives still boiled apple peels to read fortunes in their curling shapes. Young women stared into mirrors by candlelight, hoping to glimpse their future husbands. Boys carved grotesque faces into pumpkins, no longer turnips now, since the new world offered something grander, and set them glowing by the doorstep to scare off witches, though everyone knew it was mostly for fun. Halloween was still about crossing boundaries, not between life and death now, but between childhood and adventure, between civility and chaos. And maybe that's what made it irresistible. As early as 1902, towns began publishing warnings about Halloween hooligans. Teenagers greased wagon wheels, tipped over outhouses, and swapped neighbors' gates in the dark. Newspapers described the mischief as the devil's holiday. But the truth was simpler. It was a rare night when rules could bend, when the air itself felt alive. But while the kids ran wild, adults were reinventing Halloween too, in parlors, churches, and schools. The same middle-class families who once held seances now hosted costume balls. Women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping began printing Halloween party ideas. Tables draped in orange cloth, paper pumpkins strung from the ceiling, fortune-telling games, and ghost stories safe for ladies. It was a strange contradiction. The Victorians had once tried to summon spirits. Their daughters now tried to organize them into parlor games. Apple bobbing replaced divining with mirrors. The spiritual had turned social. But beneath the laughter and the flicker of candles, something of the old reverence remained. Because even as Americans tamed Halloween into a party, they couldn't shake the sense that something unseen walked the streets that night. The electric lamps didn't chase away every shadow. Farmers still swore their animals grew restless around midnight. Even the wind sounded different on October 31st, like a voice half remembered, half imagined, calling through the branches. By the 1910 seconds, Halloween postcards became wildly popular. They were colorful, whimsical, and strange black cats in boots, smiling pumpkins, witches riding bicycles, ghosts holding hands. Some were romantic, showing men and women flirting under harvest moons. Others eerie, warning, "Don't look behind you." They captured the new mood of Halloween, playful, mysterious, and a little bit mischievous. One card from 1913 reads, "On Halloween, look in the glass. Your future love may see you pass." Another shows a witch handing candy to children with the message, "The spirits are kind to those who smile." They were strange, beautiful little echoes of a time when Halloween straddled both worlds, part folklore, part fantasy, part flirtation. And then came the parties. By the 1920 seconds, Halloween had grown too big for parlors. Schools, churches, and community centers held grand gatherings with lanterns, music, and costume contests. There were pumpkin carving competitions, ghost story readings, and shadow games where guests tried to guess each other's silhouettes behind a sheet. It was wholesome fun, but also, if you looked closely, a rehearsal for the modern haunted house. The idea of controlled fear, of scaring people just enough to make them laugh, was born here. A thrill safe behind a mask, a chill that ended with a smile. It was the transformation of ancient awe into entertainment. But not everyone was laughing. In small towns, vandalism reached new heights. Mailboxes exploded with firecrackers. Farmers found their gates missing, and one Pennsylvania paper reported that pranksters even hoisted a wagon onto a barn roof. It was chaos. So communities began to fight back, not with punishment, but with planning. They started offering organized parades and trick-or-treating as alternatives to mischief. And that's how Halloween made its great leap, from the eerie and dangerous to the delightful and communal. The phrase trick-or-treat itself didn't appear in print until the 1932nd, but its spirit was already forming decades before. Instead of fearing the night, people began to welcome it, decorating their homes, lighting candles, inviting neighbors in. But here's what often gets forgotten. Even as the world modernized, people still held on to the quiet rituals. The grandmother sprinkling salt by the door. The farmer placing a candle in the window for the souls still wandering. The mother whispering a prayer over her children's beds, just in case the night decided to listen. Halloween had changed, yes, but not entirely. Beneath the laughter and the costumes, the heart of it remained the same. The awareness that there's more to the world than what we see. If you had walked through a small American town in 1899, you might have seen children carrying paper lanterns shaped like moons. 100 years later, it would be plastic pumpkins filled with candy. Different tools, same instinct. The same flickering light held against the dark. And maybe that's what makes Halloween so powerful. It keeps evolving, but it never loses its purpose. To face fear gently, to remember the dead kindly, to walk together bravely into the night. When World War I broke out in 1914, it tore through more than just borders. It cracked the human sense of safety. Families received letters sealed with grief. Streets that once echoed with laughter grew quiet. But Halloween, with its flickering candles and masked faces, survived even then. It became gentler, more reflective. People threw small gatherings where guests wore paper masks, not just for mischief, but to forget. In those years, Halloween offered something that few other nights could: control. You couldn't stop a war, but you could carve a face into a pumpkin and decide what that face meant: anger, fear, laughter, defiance. You couldn't bring back the dead, but you could honor them through flickering light, an act as old as humankind itself. Across small-town America, the smell of burning leaves and melting wax mingled with whispers of names, sons, brothers, sweethearts who'd never come home. Women tied black ribbons to porch posts. Children dressed as ghosts because, in truth, they didn't have to imagine what loss looked like anymore. The ghosts were already real. Yet even in the shadows of mourning, life refused to fade. In schoolhouses and church basements, teachers still organized harvest games. Apples still bobbed in metal tubs. Girls still dropped walnut shells into bowls to divine their fortunes. Hope, it seemed, was an unkillable thing, even when wrapped in paper streamers and candlelight. By the 1922nd, as the world tried to recover, Halloween grew louder again. Jazz replaced hymns, Pumpkin decorations went from simple to glamorous black cats with glittering eyes, orange crepe paper twisted into arches. The parties that once whispered became parades of color and laughter. And for a while, it felt like the night itself had been reborn. In big cities like Chicago and New York, masked dances filled ballrooms. In small towns, hayrides rolled through moonlit fields while brass bands played. But even then, an undercurrent of the old magic pulsed through it all. People still felt that thrill, that electric awareness that something unseen was close by. The stock market crashed in 1929, and suddenly, the funhouse lights went dim again. During the Great Depression, Halloween took a darker turn. Mischief turned to destruction. Newspapers reported Halloween riots. Windows were broken, fires lit, and small towns found themselves battling chaos every October 31st. It wasn't that people suddenly became cruel. It was that the night became a vessel for their frustration. When hunger and hopelessness haunt your waking hours, sometimes mischief becomes your rebellion. But even then, communities fought back, not by forbidding Halloween, but by reclaiming it. Churches began hosting safe Halloween carnivals. Local grocers sponsored pumpkin contests. Children received homemade cookies and paper toys in place of store-bought candy, and it worked. Slowly, the night softened again. Then came World War II. Sugar was rationed, costumes were homemade, and yet, somehow, the spirit of Halloween endured. Children carved turnips when pumpkins were scarce, painted paper ghosts from old newspapers, and paraded through neighborhoods with tin lanterns and laughter that sounded almost defiant. The darkness of war only made the glow of each candle more meaningful. Imagine a mother in 1943 lighting a small candle in the window for her son overseas, telling her children, "The light helps him find his way home." That was Halloween too, an unspoken ritual of hope disguised as holiday cheer. By the 1950s, peace and prosperity returned, and with it, the golden age of suburban Halloween. The war generation, weary but alive, wanted joy. They built houses with porches, sidewalks, and front yards, perfect for little ghosts and princesses to roam. Candy companies caught on quickly. Hershey's, Mars, and Brock's began running October advertisements. Trick-or-treating exploded into a national tradition. And here's the irony. What started as a Celtic ritual to honor the dead had now become a candy-fueled suburban dream. But beneath the laughter and sugar rush, the echoes of the past still lingered. The idea that this one night was sacred, not just spooky, refused to die. Old-timers still placed candles in their windows. Some still sprinkled salt across thresholds. Others refused to hang laundry that night, believing spirits might cling to the fabric. And every so often, a story would surface: a ghost seen crossing a cornfield, a candle that wouldn't go out, a black cat that returned year after year. The world had modernized, but the night never forgot its roots. By the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds, Halloween was everywhere: television specials, comic books, pop songs. Yet it also became something deeper, almost psychological. The masks people wore reflected more than characters. They revealed the longing to be someone else, if only for a night. A witch might secretly crave freedom. A ghost might mourn what's lost. A pirate might want adventure. That's the secret power of Halloween. It's a mirror. What we choose to dress as says as much about who we are as who we wish we could be. Even as technology marched forward, the superstitions clung stubbornly to corners of the country. In Appalachian towns, families still carved protective symbols on barn doors. In parts of the Midwest, farmers still lit jack-o'-lanterns in their fields for good luck on next year's crop. And in coastal New England, fishermen still tossed bits of bread into the water on Halloween night, an offering for those lost to the deep. You see, Halloween never truly left its roots, it just learned how to wear new masks. Beneath the costumes and candy, the same human story glows through: fear, remembrance, and the hope that light will outlast the dark. As the century wore on, Halloween became a season rather than a single night. Haunted houses turned into amusement attractions. Horror films replaced ghost tales told by firelight. Yet, even sitting in dark theaters, audiences were doing what their ancestors did centuries earlier, gathering together to feel afraid, to feel alive, and to find comfort in shared fear. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The same instinct that made villagers light bonfires on the hills of Ireland now makes families carve pumpkins in California suburbs. The fire is smaller, but the meaning is the same. We acknowledge the night, but we do not fear it. So, as we move toward the final chapters of this story, we'll see how Halloween evolved yet again, from post-war suburbia to pop culture phenomenon, from superstition to cinema. But through it all, it remains a night when time softens, when the world grows thin, and when even the most ordinary people feel, for just a moment, like something ancient is watching with quiet approval. By the 1970 seconds, the world had changed again. The innocence of post-war suburbia was fading, and something darker crept into American life. There were headlines about missing children, reports of poisoned candy, and whispers that the night had grown dangerous. Yet, at the same time, Halloween was never more alive. It became a paradox, both thrilling and terrifying, sacred and commercial, deeply nostalgic yet wildly new. It was the decade that gave birth to the modern horror film. Halloween, John Carpenter's 1978 masterpiece, turned suburban streets into hunting grounds of suspense. No magic, no witches, just human fear distilled into silence and shadow. That movie alone redefined what the night meant. For older generations, Halloween was a ritual of remembrance. For the new one, it was adrenaline fear as entertainment, the thrill of danger behind a mask. And yet, beneath all that cinematic terror, something poetic was happening. The film's jack-o'-lantern glow, the sound of leaves underfoot, the quiet tension between porch lights, all of it still echoed the same rhythm of the old harvest nights. The costumes, the candles, the masked faces, it was still about confronting darkness, just in a modern form. While Hollywood made fear glamorous, small towns across America kept the softer traditions alive. Children still carried pillowcases full of candy. Teenagers still told ghost stories in half-whispered voices. Parents still lit candles by the window, a superstition passed down without even realizing its roots. Even with pop culture's influence, the human need for ritual remained unbroken. The 1980 seconds painted Halloween in neon and plastic. Department stores turned it into an industry: rubber masks, cheap costumes, glow sticks, fog machines. Suddenly, the night wasn't just something you celebrated, it was something you bought. For the first time, companies realized that fear sold just as well as joy. Haunted houses became businesses. Candy sales broke records. And yet, if you listened closely, under all the laughter and TV specials, the old spirit was still there. In some towns, old rituals returned quietly. Families baked soul cakes again, though they now called them sugar cookies. Some carved pumpkins not with cartoon faces, but with Celtic knots or crosses, shapes they didn't always understand but felt drawn to anyway. People began decorating not just for fun, but almost instinctively to mark the threshold between safety and mystery. Then came the 1990 seconds, and Halloween went global. What began as a folk tradition from Ireland had now become one of America's greatest cultural exports. From Tokyo to London, from Sydney to Sao Paulo, October 31st became a shared night of masks, parties, and pumpkins glowing on every street corner. But as it spread, it changed again. In Japan, it became about creativity, cosplay, art, identity. In Europe, it returned closer to its pagan roots. In Mexico, it intertwined beautifully with Dia de los Muertos, where death wasn't feared, but honored. That's the magic of Halloween. It shapeshifts with the people who celebrate it. It can be silly, sacred, frightening, or freeing. It's one night that holds all of it at once. By the early 2000s, technology had woven its way into the season. Horror movies turned digital, haunted houses became high-tech, and YouTube, the platform you're on right now, became a new kind of bonfire. People gathered around screens instead of flames, but the goal was the same: to share stories that made the heart race and the imagination spark. The fire was virtual, but the feeling was ancient. And that's where we find ourselves now. The 21st century Halloween is a fusion of everything that came before Celtic reverence, Victorian mystery, Depression-era resilience, and Hollywood fantasy, all wrapped up in LED lights and synthetic cobwebs. Yet somehow, it still feels the same. The smell of a candle inside a pumpkin, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the laughter of children on darkened streets, it all taps into something primal, something that's been in us for thousands of years. Even science has weighed in. Psychologists say we love Halloween because it lets us flirt with fear in a safe way. Sociologists say it's about community. The one night where every door opens and strangers meet without judgment. But ask a folklorist, or maybe just ask your grandmother, and she'll tell you something simpler. Halloween reminds us that life and death are not enemies. They're dance partners. That's why candles still burn. That's why masks still matter. That's why the night still hums with quiet energy, even in a world lit by screens and satellites. No matter how modern we become, there's still one night when we look over our shoulders, not because we're afraid, but because something deep in us knows we're being watched with kindness, with memory, with recognition. And as you think about that, about every pumpkin glowing in the dark, every shadow that moves when the wind blows, consider this. Maybe the reason Halloween endures isn't because it's scary. Maybe it's because it reminds us that fear itself can be beautiful, that the unknown isn't always a threat. Sometimes it's an invitation to wonder, to remember, and to feel alive. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and see the last jack-o'-lantern flicker on your porch, know this: you're part of something ancient, a chain of firelight and story stretching back through centuries, A night when we face the dark, not to defeat it, but to dance with it. Because in the end, Halloween isn't about death at all. It's about how fiercely we choose to live. Hey guys, welcome back for the final part of a Halloween night in 1890. Strange Traditions and Forgotten Superstitions. Tonight, we bring our candlelight to its final glow. If you've stayed with me through every flicker of fire and whisper of folklore, thank you. Before we close the door on this journey, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and let the comments tell me, what's your favorite Halloween superstition? Because, as you now know, every little ritual holds a story. The 1890 seconds were a time when belief and wonder still walked side by side. When people feared death but talked to it as though it were an old friend. When mirrors, apples, and candles could whisper the future, and a simple turnip could guard your soul. In those candle-lit parlors and smoky village lanes, the line between superstition and survival blurred, leaving behind something deeply human, a desire to feel connected to something, to someone, to the unseen. As the century turned, many of those old Halloween traditions began to fade. The industrial world marched forward, and electricity replaced the trembling flame. The soft creak of the floorboards gave way to the hum of machines. Cities grew taller, faster, and noisier, and with them came a new kind of Halloween, one of paper decorations, store-bought masks, and children in ghost costumes running under electric streetlights. But somewhere, beneath the noise and light, those old rituals still breathe. Even now, every time you carve a pumpkin, you're echoing a hand that once hollowed out a turnip by firelight. Every time you light a candle on Halloween night, you're continuing a promise to remember, to honor, to respect the thin veil between this world and whatever lies beyond. And maybe, just maybe, when the night grows quiet and the last trick-or-treater has gone home, the air still hums with the same old rhythm, the whisper of the orchard, the creak of the floor, the flicker of a flame that seems to breathe, all on its own. Because Halloween has never just been about fright. It's been about balance, between laughter and fear, between the living and the dead, between what we know and what we can only feel. So tonight, as you lie in bed, think of those old cottages where families once gathered close. Picture the soft glow of a turnip lantern on a windowsill, its crooked grin flickering in the dark. Hear the low hum of a grandmother's lullaby, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of prayers whispered into the night. Those sounds may have faded from the world, but they still live somewhere deep within us. We carry those stories without even realizing it in the way we light candles, tell ghost stories, or glance into the dark corner of a room and smile, half expecting something ancient to be watching back. Halloween in 1890 wasn't about escape. It was about acknowledgement, about learning to live beside mystery, not in spite of it. And maybe that's what keeps the holiday alive. Not the candy, not the costumes, but the shared human feeling that somewhere, beyond the light, something sacred listens. So as this night draws to a close, let the fire burn low, let the air settle, let your breath slow until the only sound is the heartbeat of calm. The ghosts are at rest. The candles have done their duty. The world, for now, is quiet again. And to you, yes, you, sitting there in the soft glow of your own screen, thank you for walking through this long, haunted night with me. May you sleep deeply, dream gently, and wake to a morning that feels clean and calm, like a world after rain. The past is never gone. It lingers like smoke, like song, like the faint scent of honey and sage after the fire dies. But for now, it's time to rest. Good night, my friends. May the warmth made of the hearth stay with you, wherever you are. And may your dreams be kind.